Yes, my name is Greg Lampman. I'm the Director of Offshore Wind at NYSERDA. Appreciate you joining us for an overview of our fourth solicitation, as well as a bit of a program update for the offshore wind program here in New York. Can you get the next slide, please, before we get started. Just a quick overview and a little housekeeping. So for those of you who are joining us, you have been muted upon entry. But we will be taking a Q&A at the end of this, hoping to save a little bit of time for a Q&A. If you feel like asking a question, please do through the comments. Questions and comments may be submitted through the Q&A feature at any point during the event, but please be sure to submit them to all panelists to make sure that we're able to see them. So again, use the Q&A function and direct them to all panelists so that we can see them. If you have any technical problems during the presentation, please reach out to Sal Graven at the email address here. He can help you steer through whatever challenge you have in terms of putting in questions or hearing the webinar and so forth. Next slide, please. And a popular question that we often get is, will this webinar be available after the event? And yes, we'll be posting that on our events page on the Offshore Wind website at NYSERDA. So for our agenda today, we're going to be talking a little bit about NYSERDA's role in offshore wind energy development. It'll be an overview or a refresher for many of you. We're going to dive a bit deeper into the happenings in the offshore wind space over the past year, a little bit about the issues we've seen with commodity prices and inflation rates and related. That really stemmed into our fourth offshore wind solicitation that we announced a little earlier this year. We've got another work stream that has been multiple years in the making, and my colleague Morgan Brunbauer, who is our fisheries manager here at NYSERDA, is going to be joining us to talk about compensatory mitigation for fishing. This is some work that we've been leading and working with regional states on to support the foundation of a regional fund administrator to manage compensatory mitigation funds for offshore wind-related fisheries matters. And we'll wrap up with a quick couple of slides on our engagement opportunities, our work and engagement in the public, and some next steps and key work streams that we're working on. And again, as I said, we'll finalize with a few Q&A. Next slide, please. Okay, as most of you know, our work here on offshore wind is really based on our Climate Act, so the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And there are a number of goals in that act, one of which is specific to offshore wind, which is 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. But there are other components of this that are directly related to offshore wind. So the first one, and the most near term that we're working toward, is 70% renewable electricity in our grid by 2030. And so that renewable energy is comprised of offshore wind, but also going to be comprised of our terrestrial renewables. The second goal, as I mentioned, is 9 gigawatts of offshore wind specifically by 2035. We're also looking at 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. The Climate Act doesn't stipulate how we get there, but certainly offshore wind is going to be a major component of that. And then additionally, the farther out goal of by 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which again, offshore wind can certainly play a role in that by generating clean renewable energy. Next slide, please. So just a little background. A lot of folks ask, what are the different roles and responsibilities in development of offshore wind in the United States? So just a quick overview of the primary roles here. So on the federal role, and we mentioned BOEM, but I have to be clear that BOEM plays a coordinating function in the development of energy in the ocean and terrestrially. But for offshore wind, they are the lead organizer of the federal agencies in the space. So while BOEM is the center point for the hub for regulatory processes associated with offshore wind energy development, all of the other agencies, or many of the other agencies, have a role to play in that as well. And so just because BOEM is playing that centralized role, for example, there's still space and responsibilities that go to the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, National Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and many, many others. So all of those entities need to have their statutory responsibilities fulfilled through this process, and BOEM plays a coordination role in that. So one of the primary steps that BOEM has in this process is the siting and leasing of space on the Outer Continental Shelf for the development of offshore wind. So they go through a rigorous process of investigating areas that present opportunities for hosting offshore wind projects and lease those areas to offshore wind energy developers. And then ultimately, as the developers start progressing through their permitting processes, they provide overview of that and coordination of that through site assessment plans, construction and operation plans, environmental assessments, and cultural resource assessments. So again, they work on the federal regulatory processes. On the state side, there is again a mixture of roles related to the agencies and to NYSERDA. So on the New York State side, NYSERDA is the buyer of the long-term revenue contracts, or the ORACs. So we form the contracts with the offshore wind energy developers, and that provides us a certain amount of leverage in how they develop their projects. In addition to NYSERDA's role, we have state permitting processes, which are the authorities of the state agencies, such as the Department of State when it comes to coastal consistency, DEC for environmental protections and wildlife protections, the Department of Public Service, who is responsible for the regulation of the energy industry in New York, state historic preservation and, or we call state parks, recreation, historic preservation is responsible for historic preservation. All of them play a role in the permitting, the regulatory process of the offshore wind projects. NYSERDA plays a strong role in energy policy and strategy development. We also work very closely with offshore wind stakeholder engagement, and we do that in concert with our sister agencies. We work very closely with Empire State Development on supply chain development. We work with other agencies such as Department of Labor and the SUNY systems on workforce development. We work with a variety of entities on research and development. And again, all of these different regulatory activities are shared by the state agencies in New York with support from NYSERDA to try to bridge those processes. For the developer's role, they're responsible for design, finance, building, and operating the projects. They're responsible for fulfilling all their state regulatory processes. They need to make sure that they have access to the supply chain or build the supply chain to be able to ultimately build their projects. They do a lot of work with stakeholder engagement as well through the Article 7 process of the Department of Public Service. And ultimately, they're responsible for their contractual obligations to NYSERDA, which includes things like engagement with disadvantaged communities, environmental and fishing mitigation plans, labor agreement, and a host of others. So all of these different agencies and entities need to work closely together to make sure that we can move projects from the beginning of the supply of the development process all the way through the construction and operation of these projects. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we often get is, what is an OREC, or how do we incentivize the development of offshore wind energy? And so on the right side here, there's a simple graphic that the energy markets in New York are run by the New York Independent System Operator, the NYSO. The NYSO provides revenue streams to energy generators across the state, both renewable as well as fossil-based, through the form of market capacity prices and market energy prices. So those prices are developed through the markets run by the New York ISO. When NYSERDA procures an offshore wind project, it comes with an indexed OREC strike price, which is really the all-in development cost to build a project. And what the developers are looking for is the delta between the sum of market energy price and market capacity price and the OREC payments. So the OREC payments basically makes up the difference between the energy and capacity market prices and the ultimate strike price that was bid. And so you can see on the graphic, when energy prices and market capacity prices are a bit lower, the net OREC payments are a bit higher. But as the energy market prices go up, then the net OREC payments can come down. So ultimately, what you're providing is a stabilizing force for energy costs over a 25-year term of the contracts. NYSERDA purchases the ORECs as part of its contract with the offshore wind developers, and the utilities and other load-serving entities in New York are required to purchase those ORECs from NYSERDA. So we're an aggregate buyer in a sense. The cost through this mechanism, the cost of these ORECs are passed on to electric consumers across the state through the utility bills. And I emphasize they're passed on to electric consumers across the state. So in relation to the load that those utilities serve, these ORECs are purchased by those utilities in that proportion. And again, ultimately, the prices are fixed for a 25-year contract term, which provides a degree of stabilizing of long-term energy costs for ratepayers in New York. Next slide, please. So for our offshore wind program, we really started getting organized around offshore wind in around 2015. We started looking at offshore wind as an opportunity for a renewable energy resource in New York and how it can serve particularly the load centers of Long Island and New York City. And we began a master planning process back in around 2015, 2017, that ultimately got released around 2018. But in 2017, we announced a goal of 2,400 megawatts by 2030. And subsequent to that, in 2018, issued our first offshore wind solicitation. With the announcement of the awards for that offshore wind solicitation in 2019, which included Empire Wind 1 and Sunrise Wind, we also announced the signature of the climate law, which is basically, we call it the Climate Act, or CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Again, we typically refer to as the Climate Act, but basically that required, as I suggested in the beginning of the presentation, a goal of 9 gigawatts by 2035 for offshore wind. Building on that, we issued our second solicitation in 2020, which included investments in port infrastructure. We made awards on that in 2021, which included Empire Wind 2 and Beacon Wind. In 2022, we issued our third solicitation, and this included more investments in supply chain. And in 2023, last fall, we announced the awards for this, which included Attentive Energy 1, Community Offshore Wind, and Excelsior Wind. And stemming on the heels of that, we announced that we'd be releasing a fourth solicitation in 2023, ultimately announcing those awards, or re-awards, if you will, of Empire Wind 1 and Sunrise Wind in 2024. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I think a lot of us are aware of some of the economic pressures and challenges that the industry has seen. And first, I want to say that these economic pressures and challenges are not unique to offshore wind, and they're not, in fact, unique to renewable energy generally. Any long-term major capital investment projects across the country saw challenges associated with rising interest rates, rising commodity prices, and to some degree, supply chain challenges coming out of COVID or for other reasons. But in the summer of 2023, we started to hear from the developers that were under contract that they were seeing serious financial challenges in getting their projects built under the terms associated with their contracts. This includes Empire Wind 1, Empire Wind 2, Beacon Wind, and Sunrise Wind. And again, they were seeing a lot of pressures from the various forces at large, particularly commodity prices and inflation rates, commodity prices, and interest rate pressures. But also the offshore wind industry was seeing a lot of challenges around supply chain, principally due to the fact of the war in the Ukraine had resulted in the European states raising their offshore wind and their renewable energy goals generally, seeking to try to separate from Russian oil and natural gas, ultimately buying up a lot of the supply chain that was available. And again, this started to raise prices associated with supply chain and so forth. So back last summer, the developers who were under contract to NYSERDA, both the terrestrial and the offshore wind contracts, petitioned the Public Service Commission for financial relief relating to those drivers and their inability to build their projects or to move their projects forward under their contract terms. And again, the petitions described all of the issues associated with the development of offshore wind, both those external forces, but also generally in building an industry from the ground up. Ultimately, the Public Service Commission on August 12th issued an order denying those petitions. And that denial was principally based on the fact that the commission operates on using competition as a way of determining fair value and value for New York. And on the grounds of the relief being sought was inconsistent with that commission policy, they thought that it would not be in the best interest of the state to unilaterally provide financial relief for these particular projects. It could produce a perverse approach, which could result in developers in the future bidding in projects that didn't consider inflation, getting their contracts because they were the lower priced bidders, and ultimately having to request relief. So this was a way of the commission basically saying that you need to bid a project that you can build, and basically denied those petitions at that point. Next slide, please. And some people took this as a response that the state was not backing up renewable energy, or was not in support of renewable energy, or was somehow backing away from it a little bit. And that was not the case. So on the same day, the governor announced a 10-point action plan that served to support both offshore wind and the land-based renewables in New York. And that 10-point plan basically laid out the path the state would take in ensuring that the state could achieve its Climate Act goals, and how we would be doubling down on some of our investments and our work in the space to ensure that was possible. Two of the key things that were important that I want to include in the conversation today is first, we were announcing some of the large goals associated, or we were going to announce that New York was buying a lot of megawatts out of its third solicitation. And a few weeks after the announcement of the 10-point plan, we did award a little over 4 gigawatts of energy projects to Attentive Energy One, Community Offshore Wind, and Excelsior Wind, in addition to making an award to GE as it relates to blades and nacelles manufacturing in the capital region. So one of the outcomes of this 10-point plan was really leaning into the fact that we wanted to buy more projects and we wanted to buy them sooner and really keep the machine rolling forward to build this industry. The second one was that we were going to launch an accelerated offshore wind solicitation in alignment with what the industry was looking for to help try to save projects that were under contract and provide an opportunity for the state to actually procure additional offshore wind energy as part of that procurement. So in order to do that, we put out an RFI pretty quickly thereafter, and we launched our fourth offshore wind solicitation in November 30th of 2023 in a pretty tight turnaround. And I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. So following that, though, we did ultimately see project attrition with 2 projects terminating their contracts. Empire Wind 2 very late in 2023, and Beacon Wind early in 2024 decided they had to terminate their contracts and were unable to move forward. Next slide, please. So on the fourth solicitation, again, on October 12th, we released the 10-point plan saying that we're going to run an accelerated solicitation. Between October 12th and November 30th, we ran an RFI to gather input from the industry on how to frame and design that RFP and to ensure that there was going to be industry interest in it. The point, again, of this RFP was to try to provide an opportunity for those developers who had petitioned the Commission for final relief to rebid their projects in competition with other developers that were out there. So the timeline was really designed to try to accommodate the necessity of an accelerated schedule for those incumbent contracts, but also to give enough time for new contracts or new developers to bid into the process. So between October 12th and November 30th, we released and evaluated the feedback provided in an RFI. We released on November 30th an RFP. It was on the street for approximately 2 months, with submissions due on January 25th, with awards announced by the end of the month, and we're in the process now of negotiating contracts there. We made a few changes to the fourth solicitation from previous ones, as we typically do. Each round is slightly improved on the previous one, but we streamlined the submission requirements, both to make it easier on developers to submit competitive bids, but also on the NYSERDA team to be able to evaluate those bids in a competitive way. We reduced bid fees to encourage more participation, and we provided some flexibility in these to assure that we could accommodate some of the conditions that we were facing. The scoring criteria, however, remained the same from all previous rounds, which means that we evaluated projects 70% based on price, 20% based on the economic benefits that the project would provide to New York, and 10% on the overall project viability. Next slide, please. And just a few of the key provisions, and I think this is important to note, particularly for the incumbent bidders who are coming back into this solicitation, is that the contractual obligations in our first solicitation and our second solicitation were different than those in the third and fourth solicitation. So ultimately, a lot of the contractual obligations that were required for bidders coming into this fourth solicitation were different than they had seen before. So the solicitation was designed to procure up to 1,400 megawatts per project. We do require fishing and environmental mitigation plans, stakeholder engagement plans, and jobs and workforce plans. We did require proposers to demonstrate a detailed understanding of the benefits and burdens on disadvantaged communities, hoping to make sure that we could bring some of the power of these investments into those disadvantaged communities and make them part of the green energy transition. That included additionally contractual commitments to deliver benefits directly to those disadvantaged communities, including workforce training. We required them to make commitments to the U.S. iron and steel industry. We have a requirement of $140,000 per bid megawatt go into iron and steel purchases out of the U.S. This is to try to build the iron and steel industry to support offshore wind in the long term and to ensure support for labor and workforces across the United States in developing these projects. We also require $10,000 per megawatt bid support regional wildlife and fisheries monitoring. This is work that's not directly related to the permitting requirements of the individual developers, but really to help us understand the implications of offshore wind energy on wildlife and fisheries more broadly over time. We included options for risk-adjusted pricing, which included inflation adjustment indices to try to deal with the issue that we had with some of the earlier procurements, but also the option for cost sharing and savings sharing related to transmission interconnection. And we also included the option that we could hold developers who had bid into the process but not been awarded in the first tranche, put them on a wait list for consideration later. And the point here is that we're trying to provide as much optionality to us as we can. Bids are required to stay, bidders are required to back up their bids for 180 days post-bid, and we're just making use of that time to provide some optionality. Ultimately, we received 3 proposals and 4 separate bids into NY4. Empire Wind 1, Sunrise Wind, and Community Wind 2 were the 3 bidders, each offering 2 bids each. Next slide, please. And ultimately, NYSERDA has selected Empire Wind 1, who has a planned capacity of 810 megawatts, and Sunrise Wind with a planned capacity of 924 megawatts, and have put the Community Wind 2 project on the wait list. So together, Empire Wind 1 and Sunrise Wind is enough power for about 1 million homes. It is going to start building and ramping up on some of the investments that these projects had been making previously, but ultimately creating more than 800 family-sustaining jobs and over $2 billion in near-term enhanced economic benefits to New York. It's going to usher in port investments at both the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal and the Port of Queens. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, there are new contractual commitments associated with these that were not part of their bids and their contracts associated with the 2018 procurements, including $32 million in community-focused investments in disadvantaged communities, $16 million in fisheries and wildlife monitoring, and a minimum of $188 million in U.S. iron and steel purchases for these projects. A lot of questions coming out of this because the portfolio selected in NY4 is the same basic portfolio that was selected in 2018, and folks are interested in how the price has changed between those 2 different time periods. The best way to compare price between offshore wind projects is to compare their weighted average strike price in nominal dollars. And when you look at the weighted average strike price in 2000 and in our NY4, which was released as $150 per megawatt hour, and compare that to the weighted average strike price in the 2018 solicitation, it shows about a 32% increase of all-in costs for the development of offshore wind. So again, about a third more expensive than it was in 2018 to build projects today. Next slide, please. So our portfolio right now includes 1 operating project. There was a governor's event last week announcing the full operation of the South Fork Wind Farm, which is interconnected into the east end of Long Island. We have 5 projects in development. The 3 that were awarded in NY3 and are currently under negotiation, and the 2 additional ones identified in NY4. Ultimately, these projects anticipate making use of at least 5 ports in their development. And some of the key milestones that we've hit, again, we have full power coming out of the South Fork Wind Farm. It's completed and delivering. And we've hit a couple of major milestones recently with BOEM on the permitting process by Empire Wind has their construction and operation plan approved in February, and BOEM has released the final environmental impact statement for Sunrise in December of 2023. Next slide, please. And just resetting here. So from an industry perspective, if you had seen this map on one of our webinars a year or 2 ago, particularly in the New England areas, you saw a lot more colors on the board. A lot of the New England states had contracts who have since terminated, and the same can be said of those projects that are down along the New Jersey coastline. So we've seen a fair bit of attrition from offshore wind projects over the last couple of years. But New England has a solicitation on the street that's actually coordinated between Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. It's going to be closing later this month, and they expect to be making awards later this year. They're looking to rebuild their portfolio just as New York had been doing with its NY4. And so we expect to get a lot of these projects back on the map and up and running again. Similarly, in New Jersey, they announced last year they'd be running an accelerated RFP to try to do just as New York had done in NY4, which is to try to recruit some more megawatts back into their portfolio. That solicitation and draft form was released earlier this year. They expect to run the solicitation, shutting it down in Q3 and ultimately making awards in Q4. So all of the states are working together to try to make sure that the developers in the space have the offtake contracts they need to continue to make the investments and to continue to advance the development of their projects. So we're starting to go in the right direction again. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Morgan Brunbauer. Next slide, please. Who's going to be talking to you a bit about the work that we've been doing around compensatory mitigation and trying to set up a process that provides fair and equitable compensation for fisheries across New York or across the region. Morgan?
Thanks, Greg, and good afternoon. As Greg mentioned, my name is Morgan Brunbauer, and I'm the Offshore Wind Marine Fisheries Manager here at NYSERDA. And this portion of the presentation is being given on behalf of my many state colleagues, fisheries partners, and our regional offshore wind developers who are all working on this joint effort of establishing a regional fisheries compensation fund and claims process. Next slide, please. So as offshore wind energy development advances, fishermen have stated their concern about being displaced from their historic fishing grounds and the potential ecological impacts of offshore wind energy development. So while fishermen have been involved in addressing research needs and mitigation measures, they have remained concerned over how financial compensation discussions have been handled to date. And currently, the fishing compensation approach has been developed in a very inconsistent manner. This has either been done on a project-by-project basis or even implemented by different states in different ways. So fishermen have been consistently concerned and have stated that this process is not transparent, it is not equitable, and nor is it efficient. It has often led to confusion as to how they may qualify or how they are to be involved in the design and development of these processes and programs. Therefore, the states have been working together to advance and ultimately implement a consistent regional approach for administration of financial compensation to address potential adverse effects of offshore wind energy development on the East Coast's commercial and for-hire recreational fishing industries. While the federal government can require the establishment of a fund and broad valuation of funds associated with potential impacts of offshore wind energy development, the federal government has stated that they lack the authority at this time to manage or disperse such funds. Thus, the states are stepping in to provide a potential solution to fill this gap in authority for the management and disbursement of the identified funds. Next slide, please. As seen on this slide, states have outlined several objectives they wish to accomplish from this effort to bring consistency, fairness, efficiency, and transparency to fisheries compensation. While compensation has been an important topic of discussion, it should be noted that the mitigation hierarchy approach should be followed to truly ensure responsible development. The hierarchy for effective coexistence between offshore wind energy development and fishing industries is built on 4 key principles. 1. Avoid potential impacts to fisheries and fishing industries. 2. Attempt to minimize impacts when avoidance is not possible. 3. Where impacts cannot be fully avoided or minimized, implement potential mitigation measures. And finally, 4. Provide financial compensation to affected entities as the final step if other forms of mitigation cannot resolve the impact. This process to establish a regional compensation mitigation fund and administrator was first identified during the Offshore Wind Master Plan process for New York. Yet the bulk of the work for this effort has taken place over the last 3 years. It has grown from a topic of discussion at New York's Fisheries Technical Working Group to the 11th state-led effort that has included members of the fishing industry and offshore wind developers. We as states have also engaged with our federal agency partners at BOEM and NOAA to ensure that they are aware of this process and efforts to date. The states that are engaged in this effort include Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. This effort has included drafting letters of need to both the Biden administration and BOEM, holding stakeholder working group sessions to understand their concerns and considerations, drafting and releasing a request for information and associated scoping document to refine the topic and evaluate unknowns. And finally, this February, we here at NYSERDA, on behalf of the states and many of our stakeholders, released a request for proposal to select a qualified entity to serve as the regional fund administrator to design and develop an offshore wind energy-related comprehensive fisheries compensation mitigation fund and associated claims process. Next slide, please. To build trust and credibility into this process, the states, fishermen, and developers believe that any fund administrator will need to have and must have a robust stakeholder engagement approach. This engagement needs to include broad level engagement across different regions, ports, gear types, and fisheries. It should also include targeted working groups, interviews, and topic specific meetings to drill down on how the proposed task shall be completed. Finally, there needs to be an interim governance structure to help provide advice and guidance on proposed draft approaches to help provide direction on difficult decisions the administrator may be faced with. Ultimately, it is the administrator that will be tasked at making the final decisions, which shall be based on robust stakeholder feedback, advice from the interim governance group, and the expertise they bring from past experiences. At the end of the design and development phase, the administrator will be responsible for holding a public comment period on the final fund and claims process. This is another important step in the robust engagement process that should help promote transparency and credibility in this overall effort. Finally, it can't be stated or emphasized enough that drawing on the expertise and knowledge of the fishermen in this region will be key to this effort's legitimacy. Next slide, please. The request for proposal was released early February and closes at 3 p.m. on March 26th of 2024. This multi-stakeholder RFP was developed based on the feedback we received from the 2023 request for information. The funding for this RFP was provided by states, offshore wind developers, and private foundations for up to $2.36 million in available funds for the design and development phase of the Regional Compensation Fund and associated claims processes. To date, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, and New Hampshire have provided financial support at various stages to help in the advancement of this effort. Later this spring, the RFP will be evaluated by a scoring committee made up of state representatives, fisheries advisors, and offshore wind developers. Once a provisional bidder has been selected, NYSERDA will enter into contract negotiations with the hope of this work on the design and development phase will commence earlier this summer. It is expected that this portion or this phase will last up to 24 months, after which the implementation of this program shall begin. More information on this effort, the RFP, and BOEM's draft fisheries mitigation guidance process can be found using the links on this slide. I'll now pass the presentation back over to Greg to finish discussing some additional outreach and funding opportunities.
Thank you, Morgan. Get the next slide, please. I think it's a good example of the way New York approaches offshore wind development. It's not just about buying electrons. It is really trying to make sure that we're building an industry, that we are thinking about it in the long term, making sure that we're engaging and bringing stakeholders on board with the process, or at least trying to understand how we can support stakeholders and their concerns in the process. So yeah, everything from a work we do on the fishing side to environmental side to environmental justice communities, it is a lot of learning from our stakeholders, and we place a premium on that. So we have, as you've heard many times, New York leads our technical working groups, so we call them TWIGs for branding. But we've got technical working groups around environmental issues. We have technical working groups around fishing issues, around maritime issues, around jobs and supply chain, as well as with our newest one is Environmental Justice Technical Working Group, or TWIG. And it's a great opportunity for us to build these forums for discussion between the offshore wind energy developers, the regulators, and the states, really to help learn from all the folks in those different areas of what their concerns and interests are, and then figure out how can we make use of that. So we do a lot of that on the technical side. We also do a lot of that engagement on the political side, working with politicians, both at the state and federal level, to try to understand their concerns and what their constituents are interested in. But we also like to engage a lot with the public as well. And as I said, we place a premium on engagement to try to learn from the stakeholders in the space. So this past January, we went out and hosted a series of open houses in Albany, in New York City, and on Long Island, where we basically brought to these different forums the NYSERDA's offshore wind team, but also representatives of the state agencies who are involved in offshore wind energy development, and representatives of the developers who are working in those regions, as well as bringing the federal government into the conversation. And we opened the doors and had the public come in and basically engage with us as individuals, ask the questions, learn the process, and understand all the different steps in designing and developing offshore wind energy projects and how they move through the regulatory process to really understand the degree of oversight and review that these projects have. So there were a lot of success. We had folks who came in and asked a few different questions. We had some folks come in and get escorted basically around the room to learn all the steps in the process. Some folks were not very knowledgeable and wanted to just learn from the ground up. Other folks really had a good understanding of how offshore wind works and had particular issues that they wanted to vet. So it was a great opportunity for us to engage, and we're interested in doing more of that. And if you have ideas of places we could go or folks to talk to, please reach out to us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. Interested in opportunities to get in front of folks and have conversations and learn and educate at the same time. Next slide, please. And one of the ways we do that also is through our Learning from the Experts webinars. We've got more than 40 webinars posted now on our YouTube channel. These range everything from how do you monitor for marine mammals to how big is a blade and how do these projects get built. We have one coming up that people seem to be signing up for in droves, which is going to be hosted tomorrow, March 20th, which is how converter stations and substations support offshore wind. This is going to be presented by Brad Weiner, who is the Director of Transmission and Project Development at Con Ed. And these events are really an opportunity for experts in the field to just talk to the issues that folks have expressed interest in. If you have something that you would like to hear more about that isn't already in our portfolio of 40-something webinars, please reach out to us again at offshorewind.ny.gov and let us know. I'm sorry, you can register there, but send us an email at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov and let us know if there's a topic that you'd like to hear more about. But a lot of interest in our learning from the experts webinars, and a lot of really good information posted there. Next slide, please. And a few things that we have coming up. So last fall, we ran an RFI to understand how to use the remaining money associated with the $500 million commitment that Governor Cole has made to the development of the offshore wind supply chain. We ran an RFI last fall, and we are going through that now and looking at launching another RFP soon that would support the development and the advancement of the supply chain in New York. And additionally, we've been working on our Master Plan 2.0. As I mentioned in the beginning, our Master Plan 1.0 was published in 2018 and did really two things, which was to assess the opportunity for siting additional lease areas in the waters off of New York, in waters up to about 60 meters of depth, which at the time was really the technical depth for fixed foundations. We are now working on an update of that to make sure that the things that we've been doing are the right ones to advance the industry. There's been a lot of change over the last 5 years since that study was published. And we're working on our Master Plan 2.0. We're calling it Deep Water, which is assessing areas deeper than the 60-meter contour, potentially for additional lease areas, but also looking at what should we be doing to de-risk and create opportunities associated with additional offshore wind energy in the space. So looking to finalize some of that and release more information on that soon. And again, if you're interested in receiving emails or notifications of when these things happen, you can just reach out to us via our website. Next slide, please. And with that, we're going to switch over to the Q&A portion of our webinar. And I know a number of questions have been coming in. So first, as I say, always a popular question, will a copy of this presentation be made available to the participants in the webinar? So we do, in fact, post copies of our presentations on our website. It does take a little bit of time a week or two to get these converted into a format that is able to be posted. But the presentation and the deck will both be made available on NYSERDA's offshore wind web pages in our archive. There was a question about why did LIPA procure power outside of the NYSERDA process? But I think this is really referring to the South Fork Wind Farm. So the South Fork Wind Farm is actually, it's a New York State offshore wind project, but the contract resides with the Long Island Power Authority. And this was procured by the Power Authority back in 2017 via a competitive solicitation. The solicitation that the Long Island Power Authority ran was really to solve a transmission problem that they had on the east end of Long Island, where they had a load pocket that they were having difficulty serving at certain times of the year. They received a number of bids to try to address this transmission need. And ultimately, in evaluation of those bids, the South Fork Wind Farm seemed to be, or was decided through that competitive process, to be the right solution for that issue. And from that became the contract for the development of that project, which was ultimately finalized, and ribbon cutting happened last week. So that one is actually managed by LIPA and was done for the reason of solving a transmission problem, a load issue in East Hampton, as opposed to what NYSERDA has been trying to do, which is develop the renewable energy associated with offshore wind to solve our to satisfy our Climate Act. So just a different approach to the same outcome. Let's see. So there's a question about what the wait list is for community offshore wind. So as I said, in NY4, we started a process by which we could waitlist projects. So what happens when the bids come in, the developers who submit the bids are required to stand behind those bids for a period of at least 180 days after the bid is due. And that period of time provides an opportunity for us. So if NYSERDA were to make awards and release the projects that we typically do, we still have additional potential awardees behind that who would be on this wait list. And so we're just reserving that option to consider that bid for future award if we want to. There isn't anything more to it than that at this point, but we're just saying that it's on a wait list. They have to stand behind the bids for 180 days. We're just holding them to that for that period of time. So it is, again, something we expect to be doing going forward in our future solicitations, which again is just providing as much optionality as we can to the bids that have come in to try to make sure we're building our portfolio the best way that we can. Let's see. There was a question about when is the proposed timeline for floating offshore wind in New York? And I think this really goes to our master planning process. So as I said, we are working on our master plan 2.0 deep water. In the original master plan, we were investigating development of projects up to about the 60-meter contour, which at the time was the technical depth really for using fixed foundations. That line may have changed. Fixed foundations may be feasible into somewhat deeper water. And so I think part of our master planning process is to really understand the opportunities that additional offshore wind energy could bring to the state and where those projects might be located. So if you're going to go from fixed to floating, there's going to be a shift in technologies. There's going to be a need for perhaps future-proofing our investments in our port infrastructure and related. And so our master plan is really designed to think about how do we make sure that we go from, at the time it was 2,400 megawatts in our planning process, to really 9 gigawatts and beyond in a planning process. And what do we need to be doing now to make sure that we maximize our benefits and minimize our risks? I think our approach would be that we would continue to procure offshore wind energy projects. We wouldn't suddenly say, okay, now we want to procure floating projects. There would be a logical transition from fixed to floating as the technical lines and the cost lines start to cross. So again, you'll hear a lot more about this as we are putting our master plan 2.0 together. But we are going to be looking at areas both in the fixed foundation spaces in the offshore as well as floating areas, and making sure that we are maximizing our benefits and minimizing our impacts in that. Yeah, so there's a question about, can you tell us about any of the planned transmission projects and if and how those transmission projects are helping to advance your offshore wind goals? So we have had a lot of conversations with developers about the challenges associated with interconnection into New York. I think New Jersey has had similar conversations. New England is having similar conversations, and in fact is looking at floating technology in the Gulf of Maine to try to address some of the difficulties they have in landing cables and making interconnection for offshore wind projects in New England. And so one of the approaches that we have started here in New York, so the Public Service Commission last year issued an order basically asking the New York State or the New York ISO to advance a PPTN or a public policy transmission needs process, which is a way in which we can build transmission solutions in New York. They made the request that the ISO pick up on that process and begin the process of developing transmission solutions for offshore wind, and basically requesting that the bids require at least 4,770 megawatts, so 4,770 megawatts of offshore wind transmission cabling by 2033, and up to 8 gigawatts of transmission cabling by well, that doesn't have to be by 2033, but up to 8 gigawatts in their offer capacity. And what that's effectively going to do is it's going to mean that through the ISO process, they'll accept competitive bids from transmission developers who will build basically solutions for transmission. And that's end-to-end solutions. So from somewhere on the ocean, a cable would begin, would travel into the New York City load zone, would come out of the water, make overland route to a converter station, from the converter station to a substation, and the substation to the network. And those end-to-end solutions have to total at least 4.77 gigawatts and up to 8. And so offshore wind transmission developers are now out basically trying to figure out how to build the most competitive bids for that process. What it would mean for NYSERDA in our future procurements is that we would want to lean on that investment to be sure that we're maximizing its value. So future procurements for interconnections into New York City would make use of the outcome of that PPTN process, effectively separating the generation component of offshore wind energy from the transmission component of offshore wind energy. And that's an easy statement, but a pretty complicated process, and we have a lot of details to work through. And so I would expect that later this year, we'll be launching RFIs to get more industry feedback on exactly how should we structure those solicitations, how do we share that risk, how do we understand the challenges, and how do we bring as much certainty to that as we possibly can. So again, what it means is basically a separation of the transmission and generation. One of the big advantages of that is we will have one transmission developer who is laying cable in very confined spaces that make up New York City, particularly thinking about the Narrows coming into New York Harbor. And so that coordination would be automatic because, in fact, the developers who are installing those cables would be installing the suite of cables in that space, ultimately allowing us to maximize the amount of energy we can bring into New York City as a load zone, and maximizing the value of that for all of the ratepayers. So again, you can pay attention to that. I mean, the New York ISO provides regular updates to that process. There's orders on the PSC website that describe exactly what we're looking for. NYSERDA is engaged in the process to an extent, but formally this is a process led by the ISO, and ultimately they'll be the ones who are making the decisions of which projects are selected, and we'll be working on developing the procurements to make sure that those two processes interface well. There's a question about why is project viability only 10% of the evaluation. So the scoring criteria is actually dictated by the Public Service Commission order. It is the same evaluation criteria for land-based renewables as offshore wind development. Again, it's 70% based on price, 20% based on economic development benefits to New York, and 10% on project viability. In the petition, so in the petitions that were filed last year from our contractors who were looking for financial relief, they petitioned the Public Service Commission. And on the docket, NYSERDA had filed comments in relation to those petitions to help inform the Public Service Commission of NYSERDA's position. And one of the things that we mentioned was the fact that perhaps we should be thinking about whether viability should continue to make up 10% of the evaluation criteria, or if it should be higher. So I think we've started the conversation, and through the project attrition that both New York and the regional states have seen, it's worth having a conversation about whether 10% viability is the right number or not. So we don't have an opinion on whether it should be different, but it's probably, given the change of circumstances, it is probably worth considering, is this the right number for the circumstances that we're seeing right now? Let's see. So there's a question about, as offshore wind matures, what are some of the considerations you are contemplating to increase kin to the game to ensure offshore wind goals are met? This is a tricky one because we have offshore wind goals of 9 gigs by 2035, and we're always trying to assess what is the rate limiting factor in achievement of those goals. And a lot of folks would point to the federal regulatory process. So moving a project through the permitting process on the federal side is taking 8+ years. And is that going to be the rate limiting factor? There are questions about whether developers in the 2030 to 2035 timeframe are going to have access to HVDC equipment that is requisite for getting these projects built. So there are a lot of things that can be what I would call rate limiting factors or bottlenecks in the overall process. Supply chain would be another one. And so we're taking it from an all of the above view. So I think looking at our NY4, the point was try to recruit projects that were mature. So try to rescue those projects who were likely to fail, but make sure that they were still competitive with other projects that we could procure. So taking advantage of early or late stage development projects at the same price it would cost to get a project that would come online 10 years later. So we ran that accelerated solicitation to try to make sure that we could help achieve those goals. The PPTN process that I just described is another example of trying to make sure that we are advancing transmission solutions on a time frame that allows us to achieve goals. Our investments in supply chain are another example of trying to make sure that we're building our products here and we're making them available to our projects. So prioritizing the need to build products that support our projects. And even some longer term ones like the obligation to buy US iron and steel in the process is really trying to push the iron and steel industry to make investments that would service the offshore wind industry, bringing those jobs and opportunities to the United States, but also, again, making sure that the products are available to build our projects. So we're laying the foundation in the long term. We're taking near-term actions to lay the foundation in the long term in this process. So there are, just numerous things that we do to try to make sure that these projects can help us achieve our goals and that they are durable and sustainable in the long term. When does NYSERDA anticipate to issue a new OREC solicitation, given the 70 by 30 and the 9 by 25 requirements? And so we have been looking at, I think, running a solicitation late this year. We qualify that as in coordination with the PPTN process, the New York ISO's PPTN process. So we are trying to, again, make sure that the PPTN awardees are mature enough that the offshore wind energy developers can effectively put in competitive bids that would make use of the PPTN outcome, but do so on a timeline that helps us to ensure that we can still hit our 2035 goals. So it is a bit of a balancing act, and I think we need to pay attention to the New York ISO's PPTN process. And we are starting to have conversations with lots of different entities about how do we develop an RFI to get good industry feedback on what our solicitation should look like, and how do we share risk with developers? How do we make sure that we have good competition coming into that, and that the outcomes coming from the ISO or from the PPTN are not going to give an unfair advantage to one or another developer, limiting competition ultimately. But the hope here is that through this process, we'll have more competitive bids, we'll have lower prices for ratepayers, and we'll have less impacts due to the coordination approaches, coordinated process that those developers will be putting forth. Let's see. Are there aspects of the most recent expedited solicitation that will make future solicitations faster? Or was this process a one-time approach to address the specific circumstances of increased cost? So time is a motivator. So we we had to run a solicitation. It typically takes a little over a year for us to develop and launch an offshore wind procurement. To develop and launch one inside of about 60 days and including an RFI in that process was a new one for us. I was one of the people who had pretty serious doubts whether we could effectively do it, but team did a smashing job and effectively managed to get that on the street with very few hiccups, and ultimately run that solicitation and have a really clean procurement process, evaluation process, and outcome. There were a bunch of lessons learned, and I think if you compare our NY3 with our NY4, you'll see a number of the changes that have been made. In particular, trying to make it simpler for people to write bids to New York. We are trying to make sure that we are a state that brings in competition, and we've had great success in having multiple bidders into our solicitations. We want to ensure that's possible, and we're looking at our developers to say, how do we make this even better? I think there were a lot of improvements that the bidders thought were really useful in NY4 that would continue into future solicitations. They were also helpful for us in our evaluation process. We're looking very carefully at changes in, for example, contract securities. And you'll see the contract securities associated with NY4 are substantially higher than previous rounds, perhaps more in line with what much of the rest of the industry does, or other states and the way they operate in other countries. So there are a bunch of things that we think we would continue out of NY4, and we're looking to make even more improvements going forward. Okay, who will own the resultant grid? And I think this is a follow-up to the PPTN question. And so I would defer that question back over to the New York ISO. We, again, don't have a NYSERDA, or the PPTN process is really an ISO-driven process. It is instigated by the Public Service Commission, but it is really an New York ISO process. The role for NYSERDA is to really understand how does that process and our offshore wind procurements intersect, to make sure that we are providing the best opportunity and making the most of the opportunity that PPTN provides to us. So the exact interface of ownership and where the platforms would be located, or how the PPTN developers might collaborate with offshore wind energy developers, I think is all part of the process that the New York ISO is putting together. So I would defer folks over to that for more details. They have a whole series of stakeholder meetings, and you can listen in and participate and learn more about that process through that mechanism. All right, with that, I think we are out of time. Really appreciate everyone's patience and questions. And again, we're always here. If you have any questions for us, please shoot them off at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. And again, the Learning from Exports webinar tomorrow is going to be excellent on converter stations and substations and so forth. So looking forward to it. Thank you all, and have a great day.